The wind was screaming through the pines when Eli grabbed my collar with both fists, pulled me so close I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, and said the words I had waited 9 years to hear. "I can't marry her, Daniel. I can't do it. Not when all I can think about is you." Rain hit us sideways. Somewhere below the ridge, a branch cracked and fell into the dark, and for one suspended second neither of us moved, like the whole forest was holding its breath along with me. His hands were shaking. Mine were too. I remember thinking, with a strange, floating clarity, that I had rehearsed 1,000 versions of this moment in my head over the years, and none of them had prepared me for how it would actually feel, terrifying, and inevitable, and right. Then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't some soft, cinematic first kiss with violins swelling in the background. It was desperate, salty with rain and maybe tears, his fingers digging into my jacket like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. And I kissed him back with 9 years of silence pouring out of me all at once, standing on the edge of a mountain in the middle of a storm that we should never have driven into. I know what you're thinking. How does a camping trip end like this? How do two lifelong best friends, one of them engaged to be married in 6 weeks, end up soaked to the bone on a ridge in the Olympic Mountains, confessing a love neither of them ever had the courage to name? Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this happened the way you'd expect. This wasn't some sudden, reckless whim. This was 9 years of almost. 9 years of nearly. This is the story of how a simple camping trip became the most important weekend of my life, and how one kiss changed everything I thought I knew about myself, about Eli, and about the kind of love I thought I'd never be allowed to have. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I was 27 years old the summer this story really begins, though the truth is it started much earlier than that, back when I was 18, and didn't yet have the words for what I was feeling. I grew up in a small logging town 2 hours outside Seattle, the kind of place where everyone's family had lived for 3 generations, and everyone knew everyone else's business before they knew it themselves. My father ran the hardware store on Main Street. My mother taught 4th grade. And the summer before my freshman year of high school, a moving truck pulled up outside the blue house across the street, and a skinny, sunburned kid climbed out of the passenger seat and looked directly at me like he already knew we were going to be friends. That was Eli Sinclair. He had this way of looking at people, steady, curious, a little too honest, that made you feel like you were the only interesting thing in the room. We were inseparable within a week. By the end of that summer, we had built a fort in the woods behind his house, ridden our bikes to every corner of that small town, and made the kind of promises only 14-year-old boys make, the ones about being friends forever, no matter what. I didn't understand yet what I felt for him. I only knew that when Eli laughed, something in my chest loosened. That when he wasn't around, the days felt flatter, quieter, less alive. I told myself it was just friendship. I told myself that for a long, long time. By junior year of high school, Eli had grown into someone the whole town noticed. Tall, broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of effortless charm that made teachers like him and girls follow him with their eyes down the hallway. I watched all of it from beside him, his best friend, his shadow, the boy he told his secrets to at 2 in the morning when neither of us could sleep. It was on one of those nights, lying in sleeping bags in his backyard under a sky thick with stars, that I first understood what I was feeling wasn't ordinary friendship at all. "Do you ever think about, like, the future?" Eli had asked, his voice low, careful in a way that wasn't like him. "Like who you'll end up with?" "Sometimes," I said, staring at the sky so I wouldn't have to look at him. "I think about it a lot," he admitted. "I want what my parents have. That kind of forever thing. I just don't know if I'll ever find it." I remember my heart pounding so hard, I was sure he could hear it. I remember wanting, more than anything, to tell him the truth, that when I imagined forever, his face was the only one that showed up. But I was 17, in a town where the word gay was still spoken like an insult, and I was terrified. So instead, I said something forgettable, something safe, and I let the moment pass me by like a train I was too scared to catch. There was a night that same year, at our high school's homecoming dance, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from that whole stretch of my life. Eli had a date, a sweet, unremarkable girl named Katie who liked him more than he ever quite liked her back, and I stood along the gymnasium wall for most of the night, nursing a cup of watery punch, watching him slow dance under strings of paper lanterns with an ache in my chest I didn't yet have a name for. At some point, Katie went to the bathroom with her friends, and Eli crossed the whole gym floor just to find me. "You look bored out of your mind," he said, gritting, a little breathless from dancing. "I'm having a great time," I lied. "Liar." He nudged my shoulder with his, and for a second neither of us said anything, just stood there against the wall together, while a slow song played and other couples swayed under the lanterns. "You should ask someone to dance," he said eventually, not quite looking at me. "Anyone. You've been standing here all night." "Maybe I don't want to dance with anyone here," I said, which was truer than he knew, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended, because he went quiet, studying my face in a way that made my pulse spike with a mixture of hope and terror. "Danny," he started, using the old nickname he'd stopped using years earlier, his voice unusually careful, Is there something you've never told me?" The gym felt suddenly very loud and very far away. I remember opening my mouth, some reckless, hopeful part of me actually preparing to say it, right there against the cinder block wall with paper lanterns glowing overhead, and then Katie came back from the bathroom, laughing with her friends, calling Eli's name across the gym floor, and the moment folded shut as quickly as it had opened. "Never mind," I said instead, forcing a smile. "Go dance with your date." He looked at me for one more second, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he went. I stayed against that wall for another hour, replaying the question he'd asked, wondering for years afterward what might have happened if Katie had taken 30 seconds longer in that bathroom. That became the pattern of my life for the next several years. Moments. Almosts. Nearlys. A hand that lingered a second too long on my shoulder. A hug goodbye that neither of us wanted to end. A late-night phone call during our first year of college, 300 miles apart, where Eli's voice cracked, and he said, "I miss you in a way I don't really know how to explain," and I sat there in my dorm room with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it hurt, wanting to say I miss you too, more than I've ever missed anything, and instead saying, "Yeah, man. Same." There was a night in our sophomore year of college when Eli drove 4 hours through a snowstorm just to show up at my dorm unannounced, soaked and shivering, because he said he'd had a bad week and couldn't stand the idea of getting through it without seeing my face. We sat up until 4 in the morning on my narrow dorm bed, shoulders pressed together, talking about nothing and everything, and at some point his head dropped onto my shoulder, and he fell asleep mid-sentence. I didn't move for almost an hour. I sat there in the dark, memorizing the weight of him against me, telling myself this was just what best friends did for each other, even as some quieter, more honest part of me understood that best friends didn't drive 4 hours through a blizzard, and best friends didn't make my chest ache the way his simply breathing beside me did. There was another almost, the summer after we graduated, when we drove up the coast together for a week, camping on beaches and drinking cheap beer around driftwood fires. One night, half drunk and loose-limbed under a sky scattered with more stars than either of us had ever seen, Eli turned to me and said, "You know you're the most important person in my life, right? Like, actually the most important." I remember the way the fire crackled between us, the way his eyes held mine a beat too long, the way my whole body seemed to lean toward him before some old, practiced fear yanked me back. I said something about being lucky to have him too, and the moment passed, folding itself quietly into the growing pile of almosts I carried around like stones in my pockets, never quite heavy enough to stop me from moving, never quite light enough to forget. I used to wonder, in the years since, what would have happened if I had simply told him the truth on any one of those nights. If I had said the 4 words that sat lodged behind my teeth for the better part of a decade. I used to wonder if we might have spared ourselves so much of the aching, careful distance that defined our 20s, if a braver version of me might have saved us both years of loving each other through the narrow keyhole of friendship instead of the open door we both, I think, secretly wanted. But I wasn't brave. Not yet. And the years kept moving, the way years do, indifferent to how badly you might want to stop them, and go back and say the true thing instead of the safe one. If you're looking for a heartfelt love story, an emotional gay story about longing and the courage it takes to finally speak the truth, this is that story. But it took years, years of forbidden feelings, of swallowed words, of watching Eli date women who were never quite right for him, while I told myself I was fine, I was happy for him. I didn't want what I so clearly wanted. By the time we were 26, Eli had a good job as a structural engineer in Seattle, and I was 2 years into teaching high school English in the same city, close enough that we still saw each other every week. We had our rituals: Sunday morning coffee at the same corner shop, Thursday night trivia at the bar down from my apartment, a camping trip every September to the Olympic Mountains, just the 2 of us, a tradition we'd kept since we were 19 years old. Somewhere in those years, I had tried, more than once, to build a life that didn't revolve around a man who would never be mine. I dated a graduate student named Marcus for almost 8 months during my mid-20s, a kind, thoughtful man who deserved far more of my attention than I ever fully gave him. Marcus used to ask, gently, why I still saw Eli 3 or 4 times a week, why I still let a straight best friend take up so much space in a relationship that was supposed to be about the 2 of us. I never had a good answer for him, because the true answer, that I had never stopped loving Eli, not for one single day since I was 17, wasn't something I could say out loud to anyone, least of all the man I was supposed to be building a future with. Marcus ended things gently, without cruelty, telling me only that he didn't think I had room left over in my heart for him, and though it stung, I couldn't honestly disagree. Eli, for his part, had his own strange, unexamined reaction whenever I dated anyone seriously. He liked Marcus well enough on the surface, but I noticed, over those 8 months, a certain restlessness in him whenever the 2 of us made plans without Eli, a habit of texting more often during my dates, of finding excuses to stop by unannounced, of asking pointed questions about Marcus that he never quite explained the reason for. When Marcus and I broke up, Eli showed up at my apartment within the hour with a 6-pack and Chinese takeout, and I remember him sitting across from me on my couch, quieter than usual, saying, "I don't know why, but I'm not that sad this happened," before catching himself and adding, too quickly, "For you, I mean, I'm sad for you." Obviously. I let the comment go that night, the way I let so many things go over those years, filing it away with all the other almosts I didn't yet have the courage to examine too closely. And then Eli met Sarah. She was kind. I want to say that clearly, because this isn't a story where I paint her as a villain. She wasn't. Sarah was warm and funny, and she loved Eli in the straightforward, uncomplicated way that I never let myself love him out loud. She worked as a physical therapist, laughed loudly at her own jokes, and treated me, from the very first dinner Eli brought me to, like family rather than the third wheel I sometimes felt like. Within a year they were engaged. Within 18 months, they had a wedding date circled on every calendar that mattered. 6 weeks from the day this story truly begins. I told myself I was happy for him. I stood beside him at the engagement party with a champagne glass in my hand and a smile stretched tight across my face, and I told myself that this was simply how life worked out sometimes. Not everyone gets the person they love. Some of us just get to love them from a careful, safe distance, and call it friendship, and be grateful for whatever proximity we're allowed to keep. I remember one particular night, maybe 8 months into the engagement, when the three of us had dinner together at Eli and Sarah's apartment, and Sarah excused herself early to get ready for a work trip. Eli walked me down to my car afterward, the way he always did, and we stood in the cold for a few extra minutes, neither of us in any hurry to say goodnight. "You'd tell me if something felt wrong, right?" he asked suddenly, apropos of nothing, his breath fogging in the porch light. "Like, if you thought I was making a mistake? You wouldn't just let me walk into it." "Why would you be making a mistake?" I asked, my heart doing something complicated and painful in my chest. "I don't know," he said, laughing it off, rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when he felt exposed. "Forget I said anything. Pre-wedding jitters, probably." I drove home that night with my hands too tight on the steering wheel, replaying the question over and over, wondering what he had almost said, wondering what I had almost let myself answer. It was one more almost added to the pile, one more night where the truth sat so close to the surface between us that I could feel it, and neither of us reached for it. By the time the wedding invitations went out that spring, I had built myself a careful, functional kind of peace. I RSVP'd yes. I agreed to be Eli's best man. I helped him pick out a suit, standing beside him in front of a three-way mirror while he asked if the navy or the charcoal looked better, and I answered honestly, professionally, like a man who had already made peace with handing the person he loved over to someone else. I hadn't, of course. Not really. But I had gotten very good at performing peace, which is a different thing entirely, and which, I would learn that September, standing on a mountain in the rain, cannot be sustained forever. There's a part of this story I haven't told you yet, one that matters just as much as anything Eli was carrying, my own reasons for the silence I kept for 9 years. I had known I was gay since I was 15 years old, known it with a certainty that used to frighten me, lying awake at night in that small logging town where the word itself was rarely spoken except as a slur muttered in a school hallway. I had watched, over the years, the careful, coded way my own father talked about a cousin of his who'd moved to Seattle and never brought anyone home to family gatherings, the silences that fell over the table whenever that cousin's name came up, silences that taught me, long before I understood what I was learning, exactly what kind of son I was allowed to be in that house. I came out to my mother the year I turned 23, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in her classroom after the other students had gone home, because I couldn't carry the secret through one more holiday dinner without breaking apart. She had cried, not the way Eli's mother would cry, years later, with relief and fierce, immediate love, but with something more complicated, something closer to grief and fear tangled together. "I just don't want your life to be hard," she told me, gripping my hands across her desk. "I don't want people to be cruel to you." It took me a long time to understand that her tears weren't rejection so much as a mother's blunt, imperfect love colliding with everything she'd been taught to fear on my behalf. My father took even longer than that. He never said anything cruel, not once, but for almost 2 years he found ways to avoid the subject entirely, never asking about anyone I might be seeing, changing the topic smoothly whenever it edged too close, treating my sexuality like a weather system he was hoping might simply pass if he waited long enough without acknowledging it directly. It wasn't until Eli and I had been together almost a year that my father, fixing a leaking pipe under my kitchen sink one Saturday, while Eli made us all coffee in the next room, said, without looking up from his wrench, "He's good for you." I can tell. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't the speech I'd once imagined receiving. But it was, in its own quiet, hardware store way, everything I had needed to hear. I tell you all of this because I think it matters. This wasn't only Eli's story of fear and hiding. It was mine too. 9 years of loving him quietly wasn't just about protecting our friendship from the risk of rejection. It was about a small-town kid who had learned early and thoroughly that love like ours came with a cost, and who had spent a decade calculating, without ever quite admitting it to himself, whether that cost was one he could survive paying. But there was a part of me, a small, stubborn, aching part, that couldn't let go of 9 years of almost. And that part of me said yes without hesitation when Eli called in late August and said, "One more camping trip, man. Just us, before everything changes. You in?" I should have said no. I know that now. I knew it a little even then, some quiet, self-protective voice in the back of my mind warning me that spending 3 days alone with Eli Sinclair in the middle of the mountains, 6 weeks before his wedding, was not a decision made by someone who had actually let go of anything. But I said yes anyway. Because some part of me, the part that had been saying almost for 9 straight years, wanted one more chance to be close to him before I lost him for good. We left on a Friday morning in September, Eli's truck loaded with gear, a cooler of beer wedged behind the seats, 2 backpacks and a tent that had survived 8 years of trips just like this one. The drive out to the trailhead took almost 3 hours, and for most of it we talked easily, the way we always had, about his job, about the wedding planning that Sarah had mostly taken over, about a novel I was trying to get my students to actually finish reading. "You've been quiet about the wedding," Eli said somewhere around the halfway point, glancing over at me. "You okay?" "I'm good," I said. "Just tired. End of the school year stuff, you know." It was a lie, and I think some part of him knew it, because he didn't push, but his eyes lingered on me a beat too long before he turned back to the road. That was Eli. He always noticed more than he said out loud. It was one of the 1,000 small things I loved about him. We reached the trailhead by early afternoon and hiked 6 miles into the backcountry, following a trail we'd walked so many times we barely needed the map anymore, up through old-growth forest and across a ridge with views that opened out over the whole valley, green and endless and quiet in a way that made the noise in my head go still. We set up camp near a small lake, the water so clear you could see straight to the bottom, ringed by mountains that turned gold and then violet as the sun dropped. We swam that afternoon, the way we always did on this trip, diving off a flat granite rock into water so cold it punched the breath straight out of my lungs. Eli surfaced beside me laughing, hair plastered to his forehead, water running in rivulets down a face I had memorized 1,000 times over without ever letting myself admit that's what I was doing. For a moment, treading water in that clear, cold lake, everything between us felt uncomplicated in a way it hadn't in years. Just 2 friends, weightless, laughing, the mountains rising up gold and quiet all around us. "Race you back," Eli said, and took off before I could answer, the same way he had at 14 years old the first summer we knew each other, and I swam after him with my chest aching from more than just the cold water, thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was to love someone so completely ordinary and so completely irreplaceable at the exact same time. We dried off on the rocks as the light started to gold over, ate a simple dinner of dehydrated pasta cooked over the camp stove, and built a fire as the temperature dropped with the sun. That night, sitting by the fire with beers in our hands, Eli got quiet in a way I recognized from years of knowing him, the particular stillness that meant something real was working its way up to the surface. "Can I tell you something?" he said, not quite a question, "and you won't think I'm crazy?" "When have I ever thought you were crazy?" I said, though my heart had already started to pound, some instinct in me sensing that this conversation was going to matter. Eli stared into the fire for a long moment. "I've been having doubts," he said finally. "About the wedding." The forest went very quiet around us, or maybe it was just my own hearing narrowing down to the sound of his voice. "What kind of doubts?" I asked carefully. "I don't know exactly. It's not about Sarah, not really. She's wonderful. It's more like. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd watched him make 1,000 times when he was working through something difficult. It's more like I keep feeling like I'm about to sign up for a life that isn't really mine. Does that make sense? I wanted so badly to ask him what he meant. I wanted to ask if this feeling had a shape, a name, a face, if the life that felt more like his had ever, even once, looked like a life with me in it. But 9 years of careful silence isn't undone in one conversation by a campfire, and I was still too afraid of what I might hear, or what I might accidentally reveal, if I pushed any further. "Cold feet," I said instead. "Everybody gets them." Eli looked at me across the fire, and for a second, just a second, something passed over his face that I couldn't read. Disappointment, maybe? Or something closer to hurt. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Probably." We didn't talk about it again that night. But something had shifted between us, some door left slightly ajar that hadn't been open in years, and I lay awake in my sleeping bag long after Eli's breathing had gone slow and even, listening to the lake lapping gently against the shore, wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to ask the right question. The second day, we hiked further into the backcountry, up toward a high alpine meadow Eli had wanted to see for years, a place accessible only by a narrow, exposed ridge trail that neither of us had attempted before. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that made you believe nothing could ever go wrong in the mountains. We should have checked the forecast more carefully. That's the thing about mistakes. You never see them clearly until you're already living inside the consequences. By early afternoon, clouds had begun stacking up over the peaks to the west, moving faster than either of us liked. We debated turning back, but the meadow was close enough that we told ourselves we had time, and so we pushed on, reaching the ridge just as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. The meadow, when we finally reached it, was breathtaking, a wide bowl of golden grass ringed by jagged peaks, wildflowers gone to seed, a hawk circling somewhere far overhead. We stood there together for a long moment, not saying anything, just breathing in the size of it, the way certain landscapes make you feel simultaneously enormous and impossibly small. "Worth it," Eli said, and when I looked over at him, he was watching me instead of the view, a soft, unguarded expression on his face that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't have words for. Then the sky opened up. It happened fast, the way mountain storms often do. 1 minute a light drizzle, and within 10 minutes a full, driving rain. Wind tearing across the exposed ridge with a force that nearly knocked us off our feet. We scrambled to get back down toward tree line, toward any kind of shelter, the trail turning to slick mud beneath our boots, visibility dropping to almost nothing in the sudden gray wash of rain and cloud. That was when Eli slipped. I heard it before I fully understood what was happening. A sharp cry, the scrape of boots losing purchase on wet rock, and then Eli was sliding toward the edge of the narrow ridge trail, toward a drop that fell away into fog and nothing. For one endless, suspended second, the whole world seemed to slow down around me, the rain hanging in the air, Eli's face white with shock, his arms flailing for anything solid to hold onto, finding nothing but slick rock and wet air. I heard myself shout his name, a raw, animal sound I didn't recognize as my own voice, and then my body was moving before my mind had caught up to any decision at all. I don't remember deciding to move. I only remember lunging, grabbing a fistful of his jacket, my own feet skidding dangerously close to the edge as I threw my weight backward with everything I had, every muscle straining against the pull of gravity and mud and his full weight dragging toward the drop into fog and nothing. For one terrible instant, I felt us both losing purchase together, felt the ground give slightly beneath my boots, and I thought, with a strange, detached clarity, that we might both go over, and some fierce, unthinking part of me decided instantly that I would rather fall with him than let go. We didn't fall. My boot caught against a root buried in the mud, just enough purchase to hold, and both of us crashed down hard onto the trail instead, tangled together, his heart hammering against my chest where I pulled him against me, so close I could feel every ragged breath he took. For a long moment neither of us moved. The rain kept falling. Somewhere below us, rocks that Eli had dislodged clattered away into the fog, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, how close I had just come to losing him completely. "Are you okay?" I managed, my voice unsteady. "Eli, are you hurt?" He was breathing hard, still gripping my jacket with both hands, like he hadn't quite convinced his body the danger was over. "I'm okay," he said, though his voice was shaking. "I'm okay. You caught me." "Of course I caught you," I said, and something in the way I said it, too raw, too honest, 9 years of feeling breaking through the careful surface I'd maintained for so long, made him go very still. We managed to get off the exposed section of trail, and found partial shelter beneath a rock overhang a few hundred yards down, huddled together against the cold, waiting out the worst of the storm as the light began to fail around us. It was there, soaked through and shivering, adrenaline still coursing hot through both our systems, that Eli finally said the words that had been building between us for 9 long years. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain, "and I need you to just listen, because if I stop now I don't think I'll ever say it." I nodded, not trusting my own voice. "When I thought I was falling," he said, "when I felt myself going over that edge, the only thing I thought about was you. Not Sarah. Not the wedding. You? I thought, I never told him. I thought I was going to die without ever telling you the truth, and that felt like the worst part of all of it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat." "Telling me what?" I whispered, though some desperate, hopeful part of me already knew. "That I've loved you since we were 17 years old," Eli said, and his voice broke on the words, 9 years of his own careful silence finally giving way. "That I have spent almost a decade trying to convince myself it was something else, admiration, friendship, whatever safe word I could find for it, because I was too scared of what it actually was. I'm marrying Sarah in 6 weeks, Daniel, and I have never once, not for a single second, stopped loving you." The rain kept falling around us, and the whole forest seemed to hold its breath. "I can't marry her," he said, his hands finding mine, gripping tight. "I can't do it. Not when all I can think about is you." And then he kissed me, the moment I told you about at the very beginning of this story, the moment that changed everything. 9 years of almost, finally becoming something real, something undeniable, on the side of a mountain in the middle of a storm neither of us had planned for. We woke the next morning to a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, sunlight slanting gold through the pines, the lake so still it looked like glass. Neither of us said much over breakfast, but the silence between us had changed shape entirely, no longer the careful, guarded quiet of 9 years of almost, but something softer, something that felt, for the first time in either of our lives, like the beginning of an answer instead of another question deferred. We broke camp slowly, in no hurry to end the trip, packing our gear with the unhurried, easy rhythm of 2 people who no longer needed to fill every silence with words. At one point, folding the tent together, our hands brushed, and Eli caught my wrist and just held it there for a moment, thumb tracing slow circles over my pulse point, not saying anything at all, just needing, I think, to confirm that the night before had really happened, that he hadn't dreamed the whole impossible turn his life had taken in the space of one storm. The 6 miles back to the trailhead felt different than the 6 miles in. We didn't talk about the future in any concrete way. There was too much unknown ahead of us for that. Too many hard conversations still waiting on the other side of the mountains. With Sarah, with his parents, with an entire life Eli had built around a version of himself he no longer recognized. But somewhere around mile 4, on a wide, sunlit stretch of trail overlooking the valley, Eli reached over and laced his fingers through mine, and we walked the rest of the way like that, hand in hand, in full view of a hiking party coming the opposite direction who smiled at us without a second thought, as if two men holding hands on a mountain trail was the most ordinary thing in the world. It was, I realized somewhere in that stretch of trail, the first time in 9 years I had ever let myself imagine what an ordinary future with Eli Sinclair might actually look like. Not stolen, not almost, not hidden behind the safe word of friendship, just ordinary, unremarkable, entirely mine to have. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to finally receive the thing you convinced yourself you could never have, I don't think there are words large enough to hold it. It felt like relief and terror in the same breath. It felt like every year of silence collapsing at once, and underneath all of it, something that felt dangerously, impossibly like hope. We didn't say much after that first kiss. We didn't have to. We sat huddled together under that rock overhang until the storm passed, Eli's forehead resting against mine, both of us shaking, from the cold, from the shock, from 9 years of feeling finally let loose all at once. And when the rain finally eased, we hiked back down to camp in near silence, hands finding each other in the dark whenever the trail allowed it. That night, we didn't sleep much. We talked instead, really talked, for the first time in 9 years, about everything we had never let ourselves say. About the night under the stars when we were 17, both of us confessing, almost disbelieving, that we each remembered it in perfect, aching detail. About homecoming, and the question Eli had almost asked me against that cinder-block wall. "You remember that?" I asked, stunned, when he brought it up unprompted. "I thought I imagined that whole night." "I think about it more than you believe," he admitted, staring into the fire. "I almost asked you to dance with me instead. Right there, in front of everyone. I don't know what stopped me." "The same thing that stopped me from answering honestly," I said. "We were 17, in that town. It would have ended badly." "Maybe," Eli said. "Or maybe we just would have had 9 fewer years of this." He gestured vaguely between us, and I understood exactly what he meant. We talked about Marcus too, and about the strange, restless jealousy Eli admitted he'd never let himself examine at the time. "I hated watching you with him," he confessed, running a hand through his still damp hair. "I told myself it was because I didn't think he was good enough for you. It took me embarrassingly long to admit that wasn't actually the reason." "What was the reason?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "You know what the reason was," he said quietly, and reached for my hand again, lacing our fingers together like he needed the physical proof that this conversation was really happening. Eli cried at one point too, quietly, admitting that he had known, somewhere underneath all his careful denial, that marrying Sarah was going to mean spending the rest of his life running from the truth of himself. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his head resting against my shoulder as the fire burned low. "I don't know how to tell her. I don't know how to tell my parents. I don't know how to be this out loud in a town like the one we grew up in." "You don't have to know all of it tonight," I told him, and I meant it. This wasn't a story about two people falling into each other's arms and having every problem magically resolve itself. This was the beginning of something much harder and much more honest than that. I won't pretend the weeks that followed were easy. They weren't. Eli broke off his engagement to Sarah 2 days after we came down from the mountains, sitting across from her at their kitchen table, in a conversation he later told me was the hardest thing he had ever done, not because he doubted his feelings for me, but because of the pain he knew he was causing someone who had never done anything but love him honestly. He told me afterward that Sarah had gone very still when he said it, and then asked one quiet question, "Is it Daniel?" And that the way he couldn't answer had been its own kind of answer. Sarah was devastated and rightfully angry, and it took a long time, for her, and for Eli, and honestly for me too, before that particular wound stopped feeling raw. She didn't speak to either of us for nearly a year. I understood why. I would have needed that same silence, I think, if our positions had been reversed. Telling his parents was its own mountain to climb. Eli drove home the following weekend, alone, and sat his mother and father down in the same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 meals together as kids, and told them the truth in slow, careful pieces, that the wedding was off, that he was gay, that he was in love with me, that he had been for years without letting himself know it. His father, a quiet man who had spent 30 years running the town's only auto shop, didn't say much of anything that night. He got up from the table, told Eli he needed some air, and walked out to his workshop, where he stayed until well past midnight. It took nearly 6 months before he said more than a handful of words to his son. It was one of the hardest chapters of this whole coming-out journey, watching Eli grieve a version of his family's acceptance that he'd always assumed would be automatic, unconditional, easy. Watching him call me some nights, voice hollow, asking if he'd broken something in his father that could never be put back together. But his mother surprised us both. She had cried at the table that first night, but not, it turned out, the way Eli had feared. She cried, and pulled him into a hug so tight, he said he could barely breathe, and told him that the only thing she had ever wanted, since the day he was born, was for him to be happy, and that she intended to keep that promise no matter how long it took his father to catch up. She started calling me directly not long after, checking in, asking about my job, my family, my life, in the easy way that mothers do when they've quietly decided you belong to them now too. The first time she said, on the phone, "Take care of my son," something in my chest cracked open with a gratitude I hadn't expected to need so badly. His father did come around, eventually, in his own slow, wordless way. It started small, a nod at the hardware store when I ran into him buying supplies for my own father. A gruff "good to see you" the first Thanksgiving Eli and I spent together as a couple, sitting stiffly at the far end of the table. And then, almost a year to the day after that first difficult conversation, he showed up unannounced at Eli's apartment on a Saturday morning with a toolbox, saying only that he'd heard the bathroom faucet was leaking and he figured he'd take a look, and stayed the whole afternoon fixing things that didn't especially need fixing, talking to Eli in short, careful sentences about nothing much at all, and Eli called me that night in tears. Good tears, saying it was the closest thing to "I love you, and I accept you" that his father was ever going to be able to say out loud, and that it was enough. It was more than enough. It did take time. Real relationships, the kind built on something more than a single dramatic mountain confession, always do. There were nights that autumn when Eli sat on my couch with his head in his hands, wondering out loud if he'd made a mistake, if he'd blown up his whole life for something that might not even work between us. There were nights when I doubted myself too, wondering if 9 years of loving him from a careful distance had built up an idea of him too perfect for any real relationship to survive, wondering if what we had was strong enough to carry the weight of everything it had cost to get here. We moved in together the following January, into a small apartment near the school where I taught, and the transition wasn't the seamless, easy thing either of us had hoped it might be after everything we'd already been through. Eli struggled, some nights, with a grief he hadn't expected, grief for the version of his life that had felt simple, that hadn't required explaining himself to strangers, that hadn't cost him 6 months of near silence from his father. There was one particularly hard night in February when he came home late from a work dinner, quiet in a way that worried me, and finally admitted that a colleague had asked, in front of the whole table, whether he was still going through a phase, and that he hadn't known what to say, and had simply laughed it off, and had hated himself the entire drive home for laughing instead of standing up for the two of us. I remember sitting with him on the kitchen floor that night, his head against my shoulder. Neither of us saying much of anything, because some nights don't need fixing so much as they need company. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him eventually. Not because of a coworker's stupid comment. Not because any of this is hard. I spent 9 years almost losing you to my own fear. I'm not about to lose you now to somebody else's ignorance. He laughed, wet and unsteady, and pulled me closer. 9 years, he repeated. God. We wasted so much time. We didn't waste it, I said, and I meant it, even though some nights I did wonder what those 9 years might have looked like if either of us had been braver sooner. We just needed it. I don't think either of us was ready before that storm. I think we needed every single one of those almost to get us to that ridge. Slowly, in the months that followed, it did get easier, not effortless, never quite effortless, but easier in the way that anything worth having becomes easier with practice and time, and the accumulating evidence that you chose right. We kept choosing each other. Slowly, deliberately, through Sunday morning coffee that turned into something more, through Thursday night trivia where our hands found each other under the table without either of us thinking twice, through a second camping trip the following spring, the same trail, the same ridge, the same lake, where Eli stood at the edge of that alpine meadow, held both my hands, and told me that finding out who he really was had been the most terrifying and most healing thing he had ever done. This is the kind of story I wish I'd had access to when I was 17 years old, lying under the stars in a small logging town. Too afraid to say out loud what I was feeling. It is a slow burn romance in the truest sense, 9 years slow, built on a foundation of real friendship, real fear, real courage. It is a love story about the particular ache of loving someone from a distance you built yourself out of self-protection, and about what it costs, and what it gives back, when you finally let that distance close. I think about that stormy afternoon on the ridge often, how close I came to losing Eli entirely, and how that same terrifying moment became the doorway into the truest, most honest chapter of both our lives. I thought it was just a camping trip. I didn't know it would become the story of how I finally let myself be loved, out loud, by the person I had loved quietly for 9 long years. We got married 2 years later, in September, at the edge of that same alpine meadow, hiking our closest friends and family 6 miles up the same trail we'd walked so many times as boys, so that everyone who mattered most to us could stand exactly where it had all begun. My mother cried before the ceremony even started, holding my face in both hands and telling me she had never once doubted, watching me grow up, that I would find a love story worth all the waiting. My father, in a moment I still think about often, pulled Eli aside before the ceremony and told him, in his short, hardware store way, that he expected him to take care of me for the next 50 years, and that he'd know if he didn't. Eli's mother cried through the entire ceremony, loudly and without a hint of embarrassment, dabbing at her eyes, with a tissue she tucked into her sleeve for exactly that purpose. His father stood near the back, quiet as always, but when Eli and I turned to face our small crowd of family and friends as married men for the first time, I watched him wipe his eyes with the back of one weathered hand, quickly, like he hoped no one would notice, and something in that small, unguarded gesture told me more clearly than any speech could have that the 6-month silence of that first difficult year had long since been forgiven, folded quietly into a love that had simply needed more time than either of us wished it had. Sarah wasn't there. Some wounds take longer than 2 years to heal, and I understood that, and respected it, but she sent a card that Eli kept in a drawer for years afterward. A note that simply said she hoped we'd found what she and Eli had never quite had between them, and that she was, in her own complicated way, glad he'd finally let himself be honest, even if it had cost her something she was still learning how to grieve. Years later, she and Eli reconnected, cautiously, over coffee, and something like real friendship slowly grew back in the space where the old relationship had been, not the same shape as before, but its own kind of found family, built on honesty instead of avoidance. I don't know if every forbidden feeling gets a happy ending like ours did. I know that ours very nearly didn't. I know it took a mountain storm, and a moment of real fear, and 9 years of almost, before either of us was brave enough to say the truth out loud. But I also know this. If you are somewhere right now, loving someone quietly, from a distance you built out of fear, waiting for the right moment that never quite seems to come, I hope our story tells you that sometimes the right moment is the one you make yourself, even when it's terrifying, even when the storm is still raging around you. Sometimes all it takes is a camping trip, and the courage to finally say what you've been carrying for far too long.